Hello and welcome to this Bridging Gap screencast. So the fact that you are here suggests to me that you've completed the first task, so well done on that. The first task, just to remind you, or just to kind of make sure you know where you are, is the key terms for those assessment or learning outcomes, okay? For example, evaluate, analyse. What I wanted there was for you to define those terms. So now we're on to the next part, okay? So before we actually start, I'm just going to quickly go through Unit 2, okay, so functional anatomy. What we're going to be discussing in terms of this unit specifically is the cardiovascular system, respiratory system, skeletal system, and the muscular system, and specifically how all these combined help us produce movement in sport. That is from something such as a tennis serve to a 100-meter sprint to potentially potting a snooker ball, okay? So first of all, this is an examined unit, okay? So this examined unit will last for 1.5 hours in length, and it's worth up to 60 marks, okay, or it's out of 60 marks. It starts off easy with potential multiple choice, short answer questions, finally going into long answer questions, as your typical exam will go. Now, before we start with the actual subjects or the actual tasks I'm going to give you, this is how a typical lesson within functional anatomy will actually occur. You'll do something like this before the actual lesson, and you'll come to lesson with your notes. I'll discuss that when you actually come in September, and we'll go through how we're going to actually apply this to our lessons. So first of all, what we need to be aware of is anatomical language, okay? Now it's all just popped up for you there. What I'd like you to do is, in each box you have, or under each anatomical language, I want you to put the description down, okay? I'm quickly going to go through them with you now. So, anterior means to the front or in front of. For example, when we are looking, our eyes are on our anterior aspect of our body. Okay, so posterior is to the rear or behind, so our back is our posterior. We have superior, which is above, and inferior, which is below. So for example, my shoulder is superior to my elbow. And for inferior, you could say my wrist is inferior to my elbow. We also have medial, which is toward the midline. And then lateral, away from the midline. I'll discuss those two in a bit more detail on the next slide. We have distal, which is away from the root or the origin. And we have proximal, which is near to the root or the origin. For example, with our humerus, which is our arm bone, okay, the one above our elbow and below our shoulder, that bone there, the proximal aspect of our humerus is close to our shoulder, or the proximal part is closest to the shoulder. The distal part of the humerus is closer to the elbow. That makes sense. Supine is lying face up. Prone is lying face down. Deep is being far away from the surface of the body. I'll give you an example of that later on as well. And the same for superficial, which is closer to the surface of the body. And then finally we have peripheral, which is away from the center. If you think of peripheral and peripheral vision, so if you're looking straight, you can still see objects in the outside and the corners of your eyes. That's your peripheral vision. So peripheral is away from the center. So please make sure you get all of those written down. You can pause this now to get them down and help you out. And we'll move on to the next part. Okay, so in front of you right now is a diagram of the anatomical position. So this is, when we talk about the language that we use, this is the position we expect the person to be in. If you look at the palms, they're facing forward. Yep, so when we discuss all the language that we're going to be using, this is a position you have to imagine the person being in. This is really important when you are describing injuries, for example, to a specialist. Either you may be a physiotherapist after this course, go to university and become a physiotherapist. So when you're talking to other professionals, such as other physiotherapists or to surgeons, you will be discussing somebody's body and you'll have this idea, this anatomical position in your head. So we've gone through each of the language, i.e. anterior, posterior, inferior, superior. We're going to actually look now where they are on the body and discuss them in a bit more detail. What I want you to do is, as I go through this, you can label your word diagram that you have in front of you. Just the first one, the one with the actual boxes on. The second one, which is blank, I want you to try and do that from memory. So first of all, anterior is facing forward or to the front. So the picture that you can see with anterior on, this is an anterior view. So our abdomen or our abdominals are on the anterior part of our body. Okay. Then the next part we have is, so posterior is to the rear or behind. So this is the posterior aspect of somebody. The back is on our posterior part of our body. So I'll give an example of that when we do the muscles later on. We also have medial and lateral. So remember that medial was towards the midline of the body. Imagine you have a line directly down this person, straight down, vertically all the way down through the middle of them, like that. Towards that line, i.e. an arrow going inwards, is classed as medial. And then on the outside of that line, going away from that line, is lateral. So for example, in this position, the inside of the elbow here is known as the medial aspect of the elbow. If we go to this side here, the outside of the elbow here, this is classed as the lateral aspect of the elbow. So hopefully that makes sense. It's the same down here. The outside of the knee is actually called the lateral aspect. The inside of the knee is actually called the medial aspect of the knee. We also have superior. Now, from the definitions or the descriptions you just received, superior means above. So superior is above, and we have inferior, which is below. So if you think about it, the toes are inferior to the knee, the toes are inferior to the hip, the knee is inferior to the hip, superior is above, so we could say the shoulder is superior to the elbow. We can say the knee is superior to the toes, the wrist is superior to the fingertips, and so on. Anything above is superior, anything that is below is inferior. And then we also have proximal and distal. This is very similar to superior and inferior, to be honest. So the thigh bone here, so the femur, the top part of the femur is proximal to the hip. The bottom part of the femur is distal to the hip because it's further away. So remember, proximal is near the root or origin, and distal is away from the root or origin. So what it's saying is the thigh bone, the origin is up here, it starts at the hip and it grows down and ends up at the knee. So what we're saying is, if someone said the distal aspect of the femur, what they meant was basically this lower part, this lower portion of the femur, or the thigh bone. The proximal part of the femur, talking about the hip here, up close to the hip. I think I used the humerus on the last slide. So the proximal aspect of the humerus is close to the shoulder. The distal aspect is closer to the elbow. If we were talking about the radius and the ulnar bones, which are in here, if you think the radius, the proximal part of the radius is close to the elbow, the distal part of the radius is close to the wrist. And then finally we have peripheral, which is again away from the middle. Anything on the outside is our periphery. And that's all you need to know about that one. So what I want you to have a go at now is, hopefully you've got that on your word diagram. Have another look at this, you can rewind it, have another listen to it, and then what I want you to do is go to the other word document, or the other part of the word document, sorry, which is complete blank anatomical position, and see if you can remember and kind of draw what you've just learned with regards to the anatomical position and the language as well. And then after this we'll go on to the muscular system. So, with regards to the muscular system, I do not want you writing these muscles into the tables or into the diagrams that provide you straight away. I want you to use your brain a bit. So first of all, I want you to grab a plain piece of paper and a pen, and you're going to write down every single muscle I mention. Okay, just on a plain piece of paper. You're not going to look at the Word document for now. That's going to be step one. Okay, so you're going to write down only the muscles. They're going to be your notes. Once I've gone through this PowerPoint and I've gone through the muscles and I've gone through where they are on the body, this is the task you're going to do. So step one, we're going to write down the muscles. Once it's completed, okay, what you're going to do is, once I've done all of this, you're going to go onto your Word document and you are going to try and complete the muscles, filling in the muscles and where they are with no notes. That's going to be your first objective. If you cannot do that, if you struggle with some of them, the next step, instead of looking at this straight away, your next step is going to be looking at the notes. Hopefully just looking at the actual word may kind of make you remember or retrieve where this information should go. So before you go looking at the screencast, what I'm talking through you with now, try and go to your notes. If you can't go through your notes or your notes don't help you, then use this screencast to help you out. So that's how I want you to do. So first of all, as I go through the muscles, I want you just to write these down on a piece of paper. The first one we're going to be looking at is the trapezius. Okay, trapezius is this big muscle here from the front. We can also see the trapezius from the back, and I'm going to go through that one later on. So first of all, that's your trapezius muscle. If we're using anatomical language, the trapezius is superior to this muscle here, which we're going to go on to later. Next one is your deltoids. So here on the outside of your arm and your shoulder, these are your deltoids. We then have our biceps brachii. This is where we kind of change from GCSE now. So instead of biceps, it's biceps brachii now. Then here, we've got absolutely loads of muscles here. However, all we need to know are the pronators and supinators. If you held your hands out in front of you, as if you were holding a bowl of soup, that position your hands are in is supination, and that is done by the supinators. If you turned your hands over so your palms were facing the floor, your pronators made you do that movement, and that movement is called pronation, which we'll be discussing when we do this unit in September. Okay. The next muscles are our wrist flexors. So if you think of bouncing a basketball, your wrist flexors help you bounce the basketball. And your wrist flexors in the anatomical position are in the anterior view, the front here. This view, remember, is anterior. Okay, so here we've got our quadriceps. However, unlike GCSE, we have to know the 4 actual muscle groups of the quadriceps. So the quadriceps are 4 muscles, quad 4. We have our rectus femoris, which is this main muscle here. That is our rectus femoris. Then we have our vastus medialis. Our vastus medialis is here in the medial aspect of the leg. Remember, medial, lateral is the outside. So this is vastus medialis. So vastus lateralis must be on the outside. So on the outside, you've got a muscle here, vastus lateralis. And then finally, vastus intermedius is actually underneath this rectus femoris, so it's underneath there. So if you think of our anatomical language we've just learnt, the vastus intermedius is deep and the rectus femoris is superficial, i.e. vastus intermedius being deep is further away from the surface of the skin. The rectus femoris is superficial, so it's close to the surface of the skin. This muscle down here is called tibialis anterior. Anterior, because remember, this is the anterior part of the body. We do have a tibialis posterior, which is on the back, but we don't need to know that. This muscle here, hopefully my cursor's on it correctly there, is sternocleidomastoid. Now, it is a long word, and you might think it's quite complicated, but it actually makes sense. It attaches here. This bone, if this muscle was taken off this skeleton right now, here there's a bone called your sternum. Let's go back, sorry. Called your sternum. So sternum, because that's where the bone actually attaches. It also attaches, the muscle attaches to the bone, the sternum, and the clavicle. Sternocleido. And then around the back of our ear, we have something called a mastoid process, which is just a bony landmark. So mastoid. So if you think about it, it's the sternocleidomastoid, and that's why it's called sternocleidomastoid muscle. Next one is pectoralis major, which is our pecs, this big one here. Then we have rectus abdominis, which are our abs. This muscle here on the outside, or the lateral aspect, are our obliques. Finally, this muscle down here is iliopsoas. Iliopsoas is a hip flexor, i.e. it causes hip flexion, and actually iliopsoas kind of like inserts here, and its origins are actually on our spine, and that's why it can move our hip up and down. So that then is the anterior view. Hopefully you've got all those muscles down. Don't forget to pause this if you need to get them down, because I'm moving on now. So if we look at the posterior aspect, and let me go through it all first of all, then you can pause it and write them down if you need to. We're going to go clockwise. So this is the trapezius muscle, just from the posterior aspect. Now the trapezius muscle actually comes all the way down here. All of this kite-like muscle here is your trapezius muscle. It is huge. Okay, so that's your trapezius muscle there. This next muscle you need to know sits underneath our trapezius muscle. So again, the trapezius is superficial, where the muscle I'm going to discuss now is actually deep when compared to the trapezius. And that muscle is your rhomboids. So underneath your trapezius here, you have a set of muscles called your rhomboids. This muscle here is your triceps brachii. Then here we have this large muscle here, we have latissimus dorsi. Here, this muscle here is our gluteus medius. And I'll go through the gluteals when we're over this other side over here. So, similar to the quadriceps, it's no longer GCSE, so we need to know the three actual muscles. So the hamstrings here are made up of three muscles. We've got the biceps femoris, semimembranosus, and semitendinosus. So these three muscles here make up our hamstrings. And we need to know biceps femoris, semitendinosus, and semimembranosus is here. Muscle down here is soleus. So the more common one is the gastrocnemius. So this nice big one here, where you've got the two aspects of it, that is our gastrocnemius muscle, or our calf, but we need to know it's gastrocnemius. Underneath our gastrocnemius, we've got a muscle called soleus, which is there. This actually runs all the way up our leg. We just can't see it because the gastrocnemius is in the way. The gastrocnemius is superficial, the soleus is deep. This next one here, so hopefully you all know it's the gluteus maximus. We've got three muscles in our gluteals. We've got gluteus maximus, which is the big one, maximus being big. Then we have our gluteus medius, which you can see here and on this side here as well. And then we also have our gluteus minimus, which is actually underneath our gluteus maximus. So again, our gluteus minimus is deep in comparison to our gluteus maximus. So three muscles: gluteus maximus, gluteus medius, and gluteus minimus. Here on the posterior aspect, we have our wrist extensors. So when we extend our wrist up, so if we kind of have our hands out in front of us, our fingertip or our palm facing the floor, if we bring our fingertips up, that is called extension, and our wrist extensors cause that. And then this muscle here are our lateral shoulder rotators. They have individual muscles, we don't need to know them though. All we need to know them as lateral shoulder rotators. And then finally, this one here, the arrow, the muscle actually comes all the way down the whole spine. Both sides of the spine comes all the way. It's a huge long muscle and it's called erector spinae. So that is all the muscles we need to know for the posterior aspect. Together you've got the anterior aspect and the posterior aspect. So if you want to pause this again and go through that, you can. If you've pressed play now, you can hear me continue talking. So what I want you to do is, first of all, you've got those written down on a plain piece of paper. Go back to your Word document, try and fill in the boxes as you go. If you need help, look for your notes first of all. If you still need help, look at this, but try and do it from memory to begin with. After that, you have another task to do, which is just filling in some gaps, and the Word document makes it clear what you need to do. Hopefully you've enjoyed that and it's made you learn a bit about the functional anatomy course and what you're expected when you actually come into the course. And I'll see you all in September. Thank you. Bye.